All right, for our last presentation of the day, we're excited because we're knocking off state number 3 from our presentation list. So region 7, which we're located in, is Missouri, Kansas, which we've already covered. And this presenter is coming to us from the state of Iowa. And so it's Greg Welk. Greg is the Barbara Forker Professor in the Department of Kinesiology at Iowa State University. He's got a really wide range of research interests, and he's good at all of them. I first met him through his work with validating assessments of physical activity. He's produced some of the best papers on that topic in the field. But what he's going to talk about today is about some of his work with the Physical Activity and Health Promotion Lab that he runs. And he has a USDA-funded study evaluating the dissemination of the evidence-based SWITCH obesity program. And he's going to talk a little bit more about SWITCH today. So let's welcome Greg Welk for our final presentation.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here and kind of be one of the closing speakers today anyway, so hang on, we're almost done. And I think Robin and the organizing committee for hosting this meeting, I think the focus on system science is exactly where it needs to be to really make progress in this area. So I've gotten interested in this area and kind of study a related field of implementation science. So what I'll share with you today is our efforts to promote system change in schools. So we've heard, the challenges or the benefits of working on multiple layers of the social ecological framework, and also the challenges of working through system change, both from nutrition and physical activity. And I don't have all the answers, but I think what I'd like to do is share our model. Our model is, what we've done is put together a useful model to study implementation. So we're really in a unique place to do that, and we're taking our time to do it. We're rolling out our goal is to eventually disseminate this SWITCH program, which I'll talk about across the state, but we want to do it in a really systematic and sustainable way so that we can also study it. So what I'll share with you is how we both study and promote school system change through SWITCH. I did want to acknowledge Dr. Joey Lee. He's a former master's student that just finished his PhD with me a couple of months ago, so I'll be sharing a lot of his work because he was instrumental in kind of the methods and practice of how we're doing that. But I'll also acknowledge many other people. So on the left is a list of 7 different faculty members that are on our current USDA grant, and I listed a number of former graduate students. So the interesting story about SWITCH is we've been at this for about 6-7 years now, and we're still learning. But I say former master's students because or graduate students, since they do what graduate students are supposed to do. They graduate, and then they move on. And so we've actually transformed our project as well. So now we've formalized partnerships with extension and 4-H leaders, and I have a new postdoc. So instead of a lot of these people running our project, we'll have 2 leaders in 4-H extension that'll help us disseminate the project across the state, and a project manager that'll kind of keep us all sane. But I do want to acknowledge 4-H as a really unique partner. Many of you might be familiar with 4-H as being like, okay, they show cows at the state fair, right? But they do a lot more than that. They're really good at youth development, and we've been really fortunate to have a partnership with 4-H about youth, how to build youth advocacy within schools, and also how to promote the dissemination, because 4-H is in every county in Iowa, and as a land-grant university, we tap into that network, and it also provides a way to disseminate programs from state to state. So I'll share that as well. So the flow, I'll first focus on the evolution of SWITCH to SWITCH, and that'll make more sense as I go along. So it was originally a name of a program, but we've really evolved SWITCH to be a capacity building process. And so we renamed it, rebranded it, and I'll explain why. And I'll go over this implementation framework and then show some outcomes from the past 2 years. So we basically implement SWITCH every spring. So it's only operates in the spring, and we kind of learn every year, and then we retool and revisit it and enhance it the next year. So I'll just show, and I'm going to focus a little bit more on, again, the methods of how we're examining system change, since that's kind of the theme here. So this is the original SWITCH program. So notice I'm calling it a program because it was the standard kind of efficacy-based study that led to our conclusion that it's an evidence-based obesity prevention program. So it was a randomized controlled trial in multiple communities, and we had better outcomes on 3 different behaviors. So the behaviors are, we play off this mantra of switch what you do, view, and chew. So I'll have to train you guys in what that mantra means, but basically do is physical activity, view is sedentary time, and chew is healthy eating. And so we target 3 primary behaviors that do have an influence on obesity that we've heard about today. And so we want kids to switch up to 60 minutes, switch down to 2 hours or less of screen time, and switch up to 5 or more servings. And it's a simple mantra that schools get, kids get, and parents understand. So it's just a mantra really, or a philosophy that a school can use to capture all their school wellness programming. So this was the original evidence-based or publication about 10 years ago, and we've been working on a model to disseminate this, because as I'll show you this was the original concept. So it was run through a nonprofit called National Institute on Media and the Family. So they had funding and a vision of carrying this program out, and my colleague Doug Gentile was a scientific director for this institute, and so I started working with him on the evaluation. But it was very resource intensive and expensive. It was about $60 a kid. So per child, they got this fancy kit that had water bottles, pedometers, and modules that went to the parents. So every parent got a really great resource kit, but that's not sustainable. At 60, it works when you have corporate funding and other vehicles, but we had to take this evidence-based program and figure out how do we disseminate that in a cost-effective way. It focused on sound principles, behavioral tracking, kids got incentives, but it was really, kids did these trackers, and you'll hear me refer to trackers later. But they did these print trackers, and they would turn them in and get trinkets at school for rewarding them for tracking their do, view, and chew behavior. So self-monitoring is an important behavioral skill. Kids learned how to do that. They did goal setting, and all this was done through schools and also reaching the home. But the program, the key for me, is the program rights and trademarks were transferred to ISU, and I happened to inherit them and be kind of the steward of Switch to make sure it has a future at Iowa State. So it's an ISU trademarked program now when we were taking this over from the Institute, but now we had to do something with it. And so we've been studying it for a number of years now. But the key needs for dissemination when we inherited this was we had to figure out a dissemination partner. So we started a partnership with the YMCAs because they're pretty well positioned across our state and in most states, and they were already involved in Switch. And actually an interesting story was they were the original partner on the evidence-based project initially through Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which is kind of eastern part of the state, and they kept using Switch. So even after the funding went away from National Institute on Media and the Family went away and the grant was done, this group from the YMCA kept doing it, and the Cedar Rapids kind of institutionalized it, and that's a good indicator that it was really well received, that kids liked it and schools liked it, and they were able to sustain it. But again, we can't rely on one city to run it across the state. So we started thinking about, okay, maybe we can partner with multiple YMCAs across the state, and that was an initial idea. We also built a really crude, primitive website. We knew we needed to get an online platform in place. So those are just examples of some of the things we had to think about. But over a course of about 3 years, we were studying how do we disseminate this in an effective way. This was one paper that we published that we compared a print versus online program. So we demonstrated that an online version provides the same impact, the same benefits as a print version, so that was good to see. But we also concluded that obviously we had better outcomes in schools that were more engaged, and that's what some of the others have heard, or you've heard throughout the day, that it's really difficult to get schools to buy in or teachers to buy in, and we obviously found that too. So our focus shifted to how do we get schools to be engaged. And so this is what led to the evolution of Switch to Switch, and really this implementation science perspective. So the pilot data we had accumulated from 2012 to 2015 was helpful in helping us get a USDA grant. So we've been working on this grant for 3 years. We have 1 more year to go, and we hope the whole goal of a dissemination grant is really to build a sustainable model. So our goal at the end of the 4 years is that after the grant goes away, the program continues, and it's managed by 4-H and our partners there, and we're able to build a sustainable model over time. So the overall hypothesis is that switch can be enhanced and be more readily sustained when school-based modules and training are provided to more directly engage school personnel in the process. So we have shifted that we're not delivering switch, the schools are. So I'll give you, this is a kind of a busy logic model, but my team sees this all the time. This is still, it was written right in our original grant, and this is kind of what we're doing today. So our switch team works here with this 4-H team, and we're in harmony with them all the time, but we work through these, a school hub. So a school hub includes a core team of 3 is the number we landed on, but it could be a nurse, a PE teacher, a food service person, a classroom teacher, a principal. We let the schools decide who are the 3 people that are going to lead system change in your school. And that team is then tasked with kind of working through promoting parent involvement and promoting school engagement. So that team is better positioned to get their classroom teachers on board or to get the PE teacher to try a new program or to change what's in the lunchroom than if I went in and did it. So we train them and we give them what are called quality elements. You'll hear me refer to this later. Quality elements, and then they impart best practices in 3 different settings: PE, lunchroom, and the classroom. So we haven't targeted before school or recess, but we have 3 main settings that we target, and obviously we want to create that whole school day approach. But the real point I'm showing here is our team works here, and this is what we're trying to accomplish in kids. We have to work through all these arrows and boxes to get the schools to create system change in their school to change kids' do, view, and chew behaviors. And so it's, as we've heard, not easy. So we're still figuring out, and this kind of shows all the different measures we use at baseline and also process measures and mediators and outcome measures. Another model I'll show here is this one. This is developed by David Jivoltovsky. He's one of our colleagues on the project, and he's been studying school implementation models for a while. He has a project called Healthy Youth Places, and we based our implementation framework on his original model. And the key point here is that there's these 2 overlapping circles. So you heard earlier that system change requires overlap and feedback, and this is what we're trying to do. So our team here is, again, the expert team and 4-H, so we work in harmony here. And the 4-H team is the one implementing or training the school implementation teams, this core team. And then this team creates change in their school structure, and that's the self-sustaining infrastructure in the schools. So they're working on changing, creating healthy environments and opportunities, implementation in the school, and then they build capacity by learning how do they evaluate, how do they improve over time, what do they do next year that's better than what they did this year. So we're trying to foster this self-sustaining, continuous quality improvement model. I did want to add the one difference in our model now is that we also have our web interface and community of practice does provide a way that our team does directly kind of communicate behind the scenes with the implementation. So we develop the website and communicate through the web platform and also a community of practice. So I thought I'd show you that. So our web platform has become much more robust. So we now have a full content management system that lets schools enroll teachers and kids can do their tracking directly online, and they can receive badges, and the teachers can also see progress in each of their classes. They see modules directly online. So there's different levels of admin structure, coordinator level, teacher level, and parent-child level. And you know, the website, you can go here, but it's kind of protected for access only to these folks, but it has some information about our project. And the other community of practice is led by Dr. Spiridula Vazu, another collaborator on her project. And so what we're trying to foster here is getting schools to talk to each other. And so they know best like what works and what doesn't work. So the community of practice idea is that all these different schools that we enroll would share what they do and ideas with other teachers, and that we're finding that to be a really key piece of the process. So that's another key strategy. And the community of practice is also used within the school, but also across schools. So PE teachers can talk to other PE teachers, lunchroom personnel can talk to other lunchroom personnel across the project, that kind of thing. All right, so this is a little bit technical, but I want to characterize what we're doing here from a system science perspective. So switch can be characterized as a structural intervention. You might see that term because we're changing factors within the physical environment and social environment. So we're changing environmental structures to create change. But as a structural intervention, it can also be considered a complex intervention. So that's another term, but it basically means that the intervention is, oops, I went too fast. The intervention involves interactions within the setting. So these are terms that other people have coined, but so the complex nature kind of best defines what we're doing here, trying to change the system. So the key principles for our implementation, this is kind of guides what we do and what 4-H does, is to guide or promote healthy place development, promote autonomy, and that's an important thing because we want the schools to have choice. We guide them in strategic planning, promote group interactions and norms through the community of practice, and also getting the schools to talk to each other and trying to build capacity. And so we use this kind of continuous improvement model. So we guide them to plan, and then we say do, view, chew, check. So they plan, do, view, chew are kind of the themes, and the concept of switch is it cycles between these 3 target behaviors each week. So kids might track do, then they go to view, and then they go to chew, and then they cycle back again. So it creates some variety for kids and the leaders. All right, so the implementation framework, I'm going to go through this really quick just to give you a flavor for how we try to set this up. This is a map. You can't really see this. This just shows a school, the overall process, and we really start in the fall getting the schools on board, and they attend a one-day school wellness conference. That's the only time we see the schools. So we bring them to campus. We host a school wellness conference in partnership with Team Nutrition and other state entities. And that's where they kind of get the overview of Switch, and then they kind of learn what Switch is, get the resource materials, and kind of get the guidance. So that's preparation, and there's a couple follow-up webinars that kind of gets them ready. And then in January, February, they kind of kick off Switch, and we just have what we call checkpoint sessions where we have online webinars or email communications with the schools to say, how's it going? What can we do to help? But you'll see we use a very intentional process here of motivational interviewing. I don't know, how many have heard of motivational interviewing? Okay, good. So you guys know what this is. So we're employing MI actually at the school level to get schools to take change on their own. So they're much more likely to want to do things when they come up with the ideas on their own, and we're finding it really works. So we use elements of MI in our group, in our sessions here to get them to take ownership of it. And then we guide them in evaluation. So even when we're talking evaluation here as a research team, we're evaluating the outcomes, but we also train the schools to evaluate their own outcomes so they build capacity. So this is just a quick view of the preparation phase. They get training on the website, they get access to these modules and trinkets and things. And then I'll focus a little bit more on these audit tools because these are really central to how we build help them understand their needs and also set goals. So I'll go over these in a couple extra slides. And then we train them in these generalized guidelines of quality elements and best practices. So quality elements would be things like meeting at least 2 times a month, and putting up posters in the school, and communicating to parents. So those are quality elements that define effective implementation of Switch. Best practices are setting specific, so they might be things in the PE setting of using experiential PE programming, and in the classroom it would be doing classroom energizer breaks, which we've heard about from several talks, that classroom activity breaks are really useful. We recommend them as a best practice and try to encourage 3 times a week is what schools should do, but we rely on the core team to kind of share that message with the classroom teachers. So these 2 audit tools are really central to what we do, and one of these was developed by Dr. Lee, my former student. And so with this school wellness environment profile, the school fills out a series of questions, and then they get a report. We generate a kind of auto report that tells them, here's your school environment, and then they use that in action planning. So they get this kind of report that summarizes. So what we get out of the product is, when they fill this out, we get evaluations of their overall environment, but they also get feedback on what they need to change. And so it serves both summative and formative outcomes for the project. And the same is true for our main outcome measure. It's from this youth activity profile tool, and it's an online assessment that children fill out. This captures their do, view, chew behaviors. And so kids answer these simple questions online when they start the program. And then the school gets the kid gets a report that shows them their change or their current status of their behavior, what things they could work on, what things they're doing well at. And then the school gets kind of an aggregated result. So they get results that show, okay, the kids are maybe not walking as much to school. Maybe that's a target, or they could be more active at recess. And so the tools, again, provide summative information for us, but formative information for schools. So now into the implementation phase, We use this cycle again and use MI, kind of told you about that, and the focus is on continuous quality improvement. So I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. So this just shows a form we ask them to fill out, and so they fill out this checkpoint survey, but it serves two purposes again. So the schools fill out this survey, and that facilitates the checkpoint discussions in the MI, so that they fill it out and then we talk about it, but it also provides our process data on implementation. This is a statement that we give to them that shows that concept. So the process of evaluating changes is as important as the product. So use the form to understand where things are working well and where improvements are needed. So that's just the tone we use with schools. On the evaluation, then we have them repeat the SWEP and schools. So I'm going to kind of move through this fast. So this kind of summarizes this whole process. So they do these two instruments at the beginning, then they do at least 2 cycles of do, view, chew, check, and then they repeat, and that's where we guide them through that 12-week process. I wanted to now take you on quick tours of what we're finding, and so I'll focus on kind of our evaluation model and how we study this. One thing that's unique is that we enroll intact schools. So a school is our participant. So we really have 8 participants. And so all of you that are statistically oriented know that it's difficult to get really strong outcomes with 8 schools. Our multi-level model allows us to capture class-level data and school-level data, but we have to recognize that we're still studying 8 schools. And so this project was a feasibility study to test this implementation. This was done spring of 2017. This captures some of the elements in our evaluation. So from a system science perspective, we want to study the whole system. And so we try to model each of these outcomes with this multi-level perspective. So children are nested in classrooms, so there's classroom effects. One teacher may be really on board and other teachers may not. Classrooms are also nested in schools, so the core team may be really good or maybe not. And a classroom teacher can succeed even if a core team's not very good, and vice versa. A core team can be really good, but maybe the classroom teachers aren't very engaged. So we try to study that complex system. And then schools are nested within counties, and so we even study the extension impact of county youth coordinators. They can really support or enhance the programming. And so rather than controlling for all these covariates, we actually study them and measure the impact of these different things. So some examples of questions that we can ask are, does system change operate differently in schools based on size, like rural versus urban? Does school environment moderate the success? Does school engagement influence student engagement? Does student engagement mediate behavior change? Does parent engagement matter? And so we try to build this flexible evaluation framework that allows us to study all these. I'm not going to show you all those answers, but that's the structure that we're after. So I did want to show quick views of these. So we did do some analysis last year. Does implementation of switch influence youth outcomes as coded on the youth activity profile? And so this is a messy graph, but it shows these trackers. Remember I told you the trackers are really important in switch. These are the online tracking rates. So some schools were had kids tracking like almost every week. 70 or 80% of kids were tracking every week. Other schools never even got off the board. This isn't a baseline, that's a 0. That means that school never got the kids to track online. So they were in the program, they implemented it basically, but kids never really accessed the website. And so we used our indication of implementation as these implementation rates of the tracking, like were kids tracking or not, because schools controlled that, and that is indicative of their degree of implementation. So this shows school implementation. So we divided schools into high implementers and low implementers based on those tracking rates. So the top 4 schools would have been like our high implementers, and we tried to see, do we get better gains in the youth activity outcomes? This is just the activity levels in moderate to vigorous physical activity, and both groups improved, which is good, but we didn't really see a difference with school implementation in that case. We also studied class level implementation. Again, we divided them into high implementers and low implementers based on class level averages, and similar, both groups improved. So we didn't see a class level implementation, but this is, again, sample size limited. But interestingly, we found a individual tracking rate. So kids that tracked more had better gains in youth activity outcomes, which is really exciting because that shows that the self-monitoring that they're doing on this tracker actually matters, that the kids that were tracking more had better gains in activity levels in kids that were tracking less. And that makes sense. And that's irregardless of whether they had a good teacher or a bad teacher, good core team or bad core team. So anyway, that taught us a few things. We're still working through that report, but basically we found that schools were able to run programming on their own. Schools could collect audit data on their own. We just guided them and told them, here it is. And we demonstrated preliminary support for this system change model that we can start using. So this current year, we expanded up to 25 schools, and we're still in the process of working through this, but Joey was happy to have me share this work. This is what he did some of his dissertation research on, and we kind of shifted gears a little bit to study this process of why some schools are successful and others aren't. And so we focused on these constructs of organizational readiness. You've heard in earlier talks, I think, Jim, you brought it up, that implementation varies or is a determinant of whether you're going to get change or not. So implementation is really important. And so we started studying organizational capacity as a predictor of implementation. These are some citations, and this paper by Holt was pretty seminal for our work. It's defining different ways of looking at organizational readiness, and I'll show you how we operationalize that here on this slide. So we basically added questions to this SWEP tool that Joey developed, and we added additional questions that capture a school's readiness for change. And we also kind of view it as another way to think of it as capacity. Are schools ready for taking this on? And so there's organizational readiness at the structural or psychological level, and also individual and psychological level. So you can study it both at the school and individual level. Going back to this model, I know you've seen this once before, but the reason that this is important is we hypothesized that if you take our effort is here and we're trying to create change there, we kind of looked at the impact of readiness at all of these different levels of that process. So we're here trying to get change in youth outcomes, but readiness influences the ability of a school hub to take action and a school to take action, and then that influences the youth outcomes. So we tried to look at readiness and the impact on the quality elements, on tracking, and on outcomes. So I know I'm going through this really fast, but let me just show you these. You guys can all see that bar plots make sense to everyone. But one unique thing we did here is we divided the sample into high SES and low SES schools, and we're finding in both that in low SES schools, readiness led to higher implementation. So if schools had higher reported readiness at the beginning, they had higher reported implementation. That makes sense. But we had the bigger gains in low SES schools, which is where you'd want to see it, because these schools kind of already maybe had enough capacity and we didn't see the gains. So we really impacted low SES schools more than we did high SES schools. And the same was kind of true with tracker rates. We kind of had parallel gains, I guess, in both, but we're happy to see that we're able to impact that readiness improves tracking rates in both low SES and high SES schools. And we found the same kind of gains here with changes in do, view, chew behavior. This is just the physical activity outcome, but schools that had higher readiness at baseline had higher gains in physical activity in kids, and we're finding a really nice boost in low SES schools and not really a change in high SES schools. So again, I know I went through that way too fast, but that's how we're kind of studying implementation, and I think this organizational readiness construct is a really important thing for us as we go. A couple other points that I was going to just close with is this shows the gain in capacity. So when we use the SWEP tool at the end, the gray bars show where they start, and we at self-reported gains in readiness show that most schools are reporting that they're learning, they're gaining capacity. I guess we had two outliers here, but the majority are showing that they're gaining readiness. And we also have gains in activity levels in all these schools. So this shows their reported minutes of MVPA, and the red bars show the gains that are happening. And similar to other talks, we're getting that 6-minute gain. It's not a lot, but it's pretty significant when it's captured at the school level. So I guess the readiness, we think, is a really important construct for us to start understanding the factors that influence change in schools systems. We're getting higher implementation, higher tracking, and larger gains and outcomes, all with that one baseline indicator. And we're pretty interested in this outcome that we're getting better gains or larger effects in the low SES schools. So our conclusion here would be that our evaluation and maybe others' evaluation need to take into account kind of this organizational readiness or capacity for us to understand how to create changes in these systems. I want to again thank Joey and his team and our new postdoc and our 4-H partners. So we're really kind of just still getting started is the way I like to think of it. We've been doing this for 6 years and we're still learning and we have a long way to go, but our goal is with these partners in extension, we can start taking this out across the state in a very systematic way. So thank you.
Wow, that was a great presentation. Thanks, Greg. We got time for just a couple questions. Yeah. Yeah, there you go. It might be turned off.
Can you see it?
Hello.
Okay.
Oh, it's on now.
I noticed in your talk that you had monthly check-ins, and to me it looked like the schools were checking in with the research group. Did the schools have any opportunity to check in with each other so that the schools that were doing well could check in with the schools that were trying to still sort things out?
Oh, I see where you're going with that. So again, a best or quality element in the school is for the team to meet regularly. So we check that and we encourage the schools to talk to within their school system. But the community of practice is what we use to get schools to talk to each other. We still had trouble getting the schools to really open up. I mean, there's so many social media channels, and it seemed like one more Facebook, one more Twitter to some of these schools. But we're trying to embed our community of practice directly in our website so that it's easier for schools to see that and not one more social media platform to go to. But it's working. The schools that did engage in it had better outcomes. So we think it's a nice feature.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hey, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently in my work, I work here in Wyandotte County at a local health department. We have a community health improvement plan we're trying to implement. And one of the key things, the key practices, it reminds me a little bit of the readiness to change, or at least some parts of it. And I guess I'm asking you to reflect on this, like making significant requests of people in such a way so that they say yes.
Yeah.
Is that captured, do you think, in the work? Because you guys want these schools to be healthy environments for kids,
Sure.
and they do too. But there is also some significant requests that you have for them in this.
Right.
So how do you do it in a way that they say yes? And at what level is that hub thing? Is that the first request?
Yeah, I can.
Sorry.
No, that's exactly a really good question from a system change. So right now with our USDA funding, we're able to, we do task them with pretty strong guidelines and say, okay, form a team, and if you do this, you have to have your principal signature. If you buy in, then the school is opting in to switch, and then that allows us to study the intact system. If they do that through our USDA grant, we do give them $1,000. $1,000 speaks, right?
Yeah, that's nice.
But we're also, our real model is that we tell them we waive programming costs this year, but we're telling the real model is that schools have to pay for switch. So when the USDA funding goes away, we're moving towards a fee-for-service model that schools have to find funding either from a county extension office, from United Way, from their PTO, and so we do have some costs to keep it going, and so we're trying to build that in. But the other advantage we have with Switch is we developed it consistent with USDA guidelines for the final rule. So some of you might know the school guidelines. So schools are required to use evidence-based practice to demonstrate evaluation, that they're using these things. So the angle we have is that we provide a solution to schools for something they want to do already, which is comply with USDA guidelines and promote better academic achievement. We kind of heard the importance of that. So we give schools a way to do that, and we think that we'll wait and see how many sign up when they have to pay, but we think they will.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
That's great. The one thing that I wrote down is I loved your comment about how you reinforced to the schools that the process is as important as the product.
Yeah.
And I think that's, I think we often forget about that. So that's great. Let's give Greg another round of applause.